This video is going to be a step-by-step commentary on how I made this in Blender using their 2D animation workspace, so if you're interested in that, keep watching, and if not, feel free to click off. Unlike some other animations I've made, nothing fancy or overly complex was used for this one. There's no geometry node system or particle system at work, there's no shaders doing individual background animations, there's no post-effect editing in After Effects and Premiere, just a simple character drawn and moving with the focus being to see how quickly I could get something like this done and to get myself more used to thinking about how to easily set up animation projects. My point A and point B in this instance were these drawings that I quickly sketched out in Photoshop, then opened Blender. I used Blender's 4.2 build for this, which has had a pretty big overhaul compared to previous versions. Blender is constantly updating its software and making big changes to what it can do and where things are, so keep that in mind if you're using an older version. You might need to look up that version specifically to see if it has a menu and where that menu is. After loading into my custom saved 2D animation workspace from the splash screen, I selected my grease pencil object from the collections menu and pressed Ctrl C to copy it and Ctrl V a bunch of times to give myself some duplicates. This way I could break this animation up into different sections to work with one by one. Since materials or brushes are linked to your objects and saved into the program by saving your default startup menu after making them, duplicating it this way also duplicated my saved brushes attached to the original grease pencil object so I could use them in all of these as I hopped around. Otherwise, just loading or adding another grease pencil object into the scene collection would have loaded that object with the default brushes and I would have had to remake my custom ones for each grease pencil added. It's also good to have multiple grease pencil objects or to separate layers into different grease pencil objects if you're planning to use any of the effects, since they tend to be applied to the whole animation otherwise. I then quickly renamed my objects so I knew what I was working on as I jumped around. After that, I brought the draft I made in Photoshop into Blender via the Object, Add, Image, Mesh Plane menu, which is something that has been built into this version. Older versions required you to go into your add-on section and enable this feature. It loaded over there, so I just used the grab key command by pressing G to move it and the scale key command by pressing S to scale it where I wanted it. I could have told it to reposition itself, but I didn't. I'd also clicked off the record button on the bottom of the timeline while I moved it around so it didn't insert keyframes while I was moving it. When I was happy with where it was, I started drawing. As usual, I used my custom base brush that has a line and fill set to it to quickly make the base of the head and then switch to sculpt mode to grab and push it around a bit until I was happy with it. I used Shift D to duplicate the keyframe and move to the end of the timeline and just used sculpt mode to position this into place so it tracked well in the animation. It also moved the draft plane mesh to the side with the record button on so it started on the first frame draft and ended on the second as reference as I skimmed the timeline. I created new layers for the eyes, nose, mouth, and eyebrows and used the same method of duplicating and transforming with the sculpt and rotation tools to match the reference position change and make sure that it would track well. I find with anime-styled noses, it's been easiest to draw the end position first, then just rotate the view to keep it consistent with the perspective change during motion. For the brows, I used the Lattice Mesh Transform Warp tool by pressing Ctrl T. This is an unofficial add-on that was made for Grease Pencil by another artist. In older versions, you can search Grease Pencil add-ons to find and enable it. I think it's just called Grease Pencil Tools. In order to get it in 4.2, you have to enable internet access in the edit menu to search for it and reinstall it since Blender took out a lot of add-ons that weren't part of its build. I highly recommend you get it though and enable it because being able to warp transform is pretty essential for drawing and animating digitally. When I was done setting up the base keyframes for the head, I went into the modifier menu and set up a tint modifier to change the color of the fill to the skin color. This is the fastest, easiest, and most edit-friendly way I've found to color all frames in Grease Pencil so far, and is what I mainly use now. I duplicated this modifier and told each to influence the fill colors of the face and the nose individually, then locked all my layers and created a new layer to start working on the eyeballs. I created a new layer for the eyeballs and used my stroke and fill brush for the base and my stroke brush for the parts of the eyes I wanted to be kept specific colors. I chose the colors I wanted for my strokes by switching to vertex color on the top and did them one by one using the stroke brush. I then used another tint modifier and told it to influence on the fill of the eyes only to change the base color dark purple. When the eyes were set up how I wanted, I used the same method of duplicating the keyframe and dragging it to the end, where I then used the Move, Sculpt, and Transform tools to position them in place. With the keyframes set, I used the Grease Pencil Interpolation menu to set up the default in-betweening as frame reference while I kept working and skimming between the two keyframes. With this done, I then ticked on the mask option in the layer menu to clip the eyeballs to the eye whites, and then gave the white a tint modifier to cover the line since I wasn't using it as a reference anymore, and was ready to start the lashes on a new layer, which again I animated the same, so nothing new to add here. I wanted to add some soft blush, so I put this on a separate grease pencil object and grabbed an airbrush. By keeping it on a separate object, I can apply a blur effect and get a really soft look. Since it drew behind my other grease pencil, I went into the 3D space and moved it in front. There's a way to tell to draw in front, but I just moved them manually anyway. When that was done, I switched back to the head and started the base of the hair on a new layer. I switched back to my stroke and fill brush and laid out the keyframes and set the color with a modifier, then clipped it down on the face using another layer mask. In retrospect, I could have done this a couple different ways to keep the outer line, but I didn't. From that point on, I started working on the bangs. On a new layer, I used my stroke and fill brush for the base and the stroke brush for the additional lines, then switched to a fill only brush to cover the lines on top I didn't want, before duplicating my hair tint modifier and applying it to the bang layer. I did the same for the right and left bangs and moved them under the center bang according to my layer order, and then started on the back pony, which I should have done on a separate grease pencil object, but didn't. I then decided to add an ear and moved its layer position below the side bang and above the face layers using the little up and down arrows on the layer box. When the base of the head was done, I switched grease pencil objects to start working on the base of the body. I wanted the torso to move independently from the head and arms, so I broke it up into different chunks on separate layers, starting with the top. I then did the bottom torso, followed by the pants. I wasn't sure if I wanted to animate the legs or lower torso, but I set it up so I could easily if I did want to later on. I used stroke brush for the inner detail lines so they were easier to move around where I wanted during the perspective change. Since I was going to be animating the arms moving on their own, it was important to keep the collarbones separate to move along with them. When I was done with the torso layers, I moved to a different grease pencil object to start drawing and animating the arm. I did the base with the stroke and fill brush, and then used a fill brush to cover the line I didn't want showing where the arm comes out of the shoulder. I then did the back arm on a separate grease pencil object and used the transform tool to create the upper bend. I'd already gone into the 3D space to move this arm behind the torso where I wanted it. Lastly, I added a bit more cloth to hide the torso line on that side. With all of that done, I was finally done setting up the base keyframes for the character how I wanted them and began to focus on fine-tuning the areas to get it ready to add the in-between animation, interpolation, and type of easing I wanted each part to have. I decided I wanted to have her raise her arm, so I used the transform tool to quickly and easily change that keyframe into a raised position, then continued cleaning up and fine-tuning. Having her torso and head moving in different ways at different speeds left some gaps, so I quickly went in and deleted the in-between animations and pulled the neck up on both keyframes to fix this before reapplying the in-betweens. With my viewport set to onion skin mode, I then skimmed each individual new frame and began tweaking the shoulder and collarbones to better show the raise of her arm. I made a few more final tweaks and retimed the blush to match the new time of her face before moving on to some additional minor effects. I added a noise modifier and set the influence to the eyeballs so she had a very anime looking eye quiver. Lastly, I added a rim light effect to each grease pencil object and copied the settings to give her some uniform lighting that would move along with the frame so she was a bit more interesting to look at. I then messed around for a while and wound up liking what the length modifier did to her back braid, so I kept that and added a light to the scene to give her a subtle gradient tinted look. Then I set her up to render out as an animation. The original footage duration of this process video was a bit over 5 hours. After cutting out a lot with the first edit that wasn't needed, like multiple play passes and breaks, it looks like it took about 3 hours to do this much animation start to finish in the end. Hopefully some things in this process video were interesting and helpful to you. That's it for this one though. Later.